Let's be direct about what this is. CENTCOM has formally requested the deployment of the Army's Dark Eagle hypersonic missile to the Middle East. The stated purpose is potential use against Iran. This is the United States Army's first operationally deployed hypersonic weapon system, officially designated the Long-Range Hypersonic Weapon. It carries a boost glide body. It travels at speeds exceeding Mach 5. Its operational range exceeds 1,725 miles. It was designed from the ground up to engage high-value, time-sensitive targets that current weapons either cannot reach fast enough or cannot penetrate at all. Hardened underground installations, deeply buried command infrastructure, reinforced bunkers constructed precisely to survive conventional strikes. That is what this weapon was built for. That is the technical description. Now let's talk about what it actually means strategically, because the two are very different things. The appearance of the Dark Eagle in this conversation is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of a search. When a military command begins reaching for its most exotic, least tested, most technologically advanced option in the middle of an ongoing operation, that is not confidence. That is the behavior of a force that has cycled through its conventional options and found them insufficient. That is the behavior of a command structure looking for something, anything that changes the equation. And that distinction matters enormously because the weapon itself does not answer the question that actually drives this crisis. The question is not whether the United States can strike a target inside Iran. The question is whether any strike, conventional, hypersonic, or otherwise, will compel the Iranian government to alter its fundamental strategic position. And the answer to that question has nothing to do with the velocity of the warhead. Here is what the historical record tells us about this moment. In the final year of the Second World War, the German High Command did exactly this. By 1944 and into 1945, Hitler was no longer managing a coherent military strategy. He was searching for silver bullets, advanced jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, innovative submarine designs, weapons that, had they been developed and fielded at scale in 1940 or 1941, might have altered the trajectory of the war in meaningful ways. But they were not developed then. They arrived 4 years too late, deployed in insufficient numbers, against an adversary coalition that had already achieved overwhelming material and strategic momentum. Those weapons did not change the outcome. They did not delay the outcome in any significant way. The war ended on the terms it was always going to end on, once the strategic balance had shifted irreversibly. The silver bullets were a psychological comfort, a way for a leadership in crisis to tell itself that the next weapon, the next strike, the next technological edge would reverse what was already irreversible. That is precisely the parallel that applies now. The Dark Eagle is not arriving at the beginning of a campaign when operational options are open and strategic initiative still exists. It is arriving at a moment of visible strain, diminishing carrier presence, extended deployments, a diplomatic track that is stalled, and an adversary that has not moved from its core positions despite sustained military pressure. Introducing a hypersonic missile into that environment does not reopen closed strategic options. It signals that closed options are being recognized and that the search for a substitute has begun. Now let's address the diplomatic dimension, because it is inseparable from the military one. Any negotiated settlement, any agreement that actually holds, requires both parties to believe that commitments will be honored. That is not a soft observation. That is a hard operational fact. Without credibility, there is no agreement. Without an agreement that holds, there is no resolution. Only a pause before the next escalation cycle. And right now, the credibility of the United States as a treaty partner is at its lowest point in modern history. Not because of perception, because of the record. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, was one of the most strategically consequential arms control agreements ever negotiated. It did not simply limit a category of weapons, it eliminated it. Both the United States and the Soviet Union recognized that intermediate-range ballistic and cruise missiles deployed in the European theater created a first-strike dynamic that compressed decision timelines to the point of near zero. Either side, facing a launch warning, would have had minutes, not hours, to determine whether the warning was real and to respond. That is an environment engineered for catastrophic miscalculation. The INF Treaty removed that danger by removing the weapons. It was a serious achievement of serious diplomacy. It was discarded, casually, without replacement, without a successor framework, without any alternative verification architecture to fill the void it left. That is the record Iran is reading. That is the record Russia is reading. That is the record China is reading. Every potential counterparty to any agreement that Washington might propose is reading that record and drawing the rational conclusion that the United States will sign agreements when it suits American interests and exit them when it does not. And if that is the operating assumption in Tehran, then the Iranian government has no rational basis for entering into any binding commitment. The best outcome for Iran, viewed from that lens, is not a negotiated settlement. The best outcome is strategic patience, outlast the pressure, preserve the program, wait for Washington to exhaust itself and disengage, because history suggests that is what eventually happens. Now consider what Iran has actually communicated in recent days. The Iranian Navy commander has publicly stated that something is coming, something he described as what they deeply fear placed directly at their doorstep. That is not rhetorical noise. Senior Iranian officials have stated explicitly that a naval blockade will not be tolerated and that any continuation of the blockade will produce a direct response. These are not vague warnings. They are specific, public, attributed statements from senior military and political leadership, and they align with what Iran's response architecture actually looks like when modeled operationally. A full Iranian response does not look like a single retaliatory strike. It looks like a campaign. Energy infrastructure across the Gulf states, vulnerable, exposed, and high consequence. Closure of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which controls access between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and carries a substantial fraction of global maritime trade. Damage to undersea communications cables serving Gulf nations. Infrastructure that is difficult to defend, nearly impossible to protect along its entire length, and costly to repair. These are not hypothetical. These are telegraphed. They have been communicated clearly and consistently, and they reflect a coherent escalation strategy built around denying the United States and its partners the economic and logistical benefits they are attempting to protect. The critical strategic question, the one that overrides all the tactical and weapons system discussions, is who holds escalation dominance? Who controls the pace and direction of escalation? Who can impose costs faster than the other side can absorb them? And the honest answer right now is that the escalation initiative has shifted to Iran. This is not an ideological judgment. It is a force disposition analysis. The United States is operating at the end of a 6,000 to 7,000 mile logistics chain. Every aircraft, every munition, every spare part, every crew rotation has to travel that distance to reach the theater. That imposes constraints on tempo, on sustained intensity, and on the ability to absorb attrition and continue operations. The Gerald Ford Carrier Group is heading home. That is not a planned rotation in the conventional sense. That is a force that is being driven to the edge of its operational envelope, equipment degraded, crews exhausted, and needs to be withdrawn to recover. What remains in theater is 2 carrier battle groups and Air Force assets. That is the available striking force. It is significant, but it is not unlimited, and it is operating against an adversary that is fighting on interior lines, on its own territory, with a population that has demonstrated it will absorb enormous pressure without surrendering strategic cohesion. The phone call between Putin and Trump in this context is not incidental. Putin understands escalation dynamics better than almost any other leader currently operating. His read of this situation, communicated directly to Trump, almost certainly included a clear assessment: Iran is in an existential fight. When a state believes its survival is at stake, it does not moderate its response based on the quality of the incoming weapon. It responds with everything available. There is no incentive for Iran to hold back. There is no incentive to believe American assurances. And there is no third-party framework, no Chinese guarantee, no Russian guarantee, no international verification architecture that currently exists to make any agreement credible to Tehran. If any agreement is going to hold, Iran will require external guarantors, not American promises. External guarantors with the strategic weight to enforce compliance. and that means Moscow and Beijing. That is the diplomatic architecture that any real settlement requires, and it is the architecture that American policy has spent years actively undermining. Now let's look at the historical parallel more carefully, because it illuminates how capable states end up in strategically untenable positions. In August 1914, the British cabinet was not unanimous about entering the war. A significant faction argued that Britain had no direct strategic interest in a continental land war between Germany, Austria, Russia, and France. The counter-argument, driven largely by Churchill, was built around British naval supremacy. The logic was that the Royal Navy would force a decisive fleet engagement in the North Sea, the German fleet would be destroyed, and the shock of that defeat would collapse German will to continue. The war would be decided at sea, quickly, by the instrument of power that Britain had spent a century building and that defined British strategic identity. It was a compelling argument to the British. It was built entirely on how the British saw their own power. It had very little to do with how Germany would actually respond to a naval defeat, or whether the destruction of the German fleet in the North Sea would have any meaningful effect on an army of millions already advancing through Belgium. The British expeditionary force that crossed to France was approximately 150,000 men. It was a professional, well-trained force. It was also radically insufficient for the scale of the conflict it was being committed to. Within weeks, it had retreated 230 miles under sustained German pressure, absorbing catastrophic losses in the process. The BEF commander, General French, recommended withdrawal to the coast, get to the ports, evacuate, accept the operational reality, and disengage before the force was destroyed entirely. The British government refused. National prestige, strategic credibility, the position of a global power. The calculation was that disengagement was more costly than continuation, not in military terms, but in terms of what it would signal to the world about Britain's willingness to honor commitments and project power. They stayed, and the consequences of that decision are etched into British history. Over 800,000 dead, an economy structurally damaged by the cost of the war, a global financial position that never fully recovered, a demographic wound that shaped British society for a generation. The war that Britain did not have to fight, that Britain entered through an obscure treaty obligation and a flawed strategic calculation, consumed the core of British power. And the peace that followed was so unstable, so punitive, so structurally broken, that it produced the Second World War within 20 years. The application of that history to the present situation is not metaphorical. It is operational. The United States entered this confrontation with Iran, operating through its own strategic lens, unmatched air power, the most capable naval aviation force ever assembled, technological overmatch across virtually every measurable dimension, an adversary with a GDP that represents a small fraction of American output, and a defense budget that, by comparison, is negligible. The assessment made with confidence at the highest levels was that these advantages were decisive, that they would translate into a rapid compression of Iranian options and a swift resolution on American terms. That assessment has not proven correct. Air power does not occupy territory. Naval power cannot compel a government that has decided to absorb the cost of confrontation. Ground forces, if introduced, face a theater that swallows armies. And the United States Army, shaped by 2 decades of counterinsurgency and budget constraints, does not have the mass to conduct large-scale ground operations in Iran and sustain them. What is accumulating in the background while this strategic debate continues is a set of domestic economic pressures that impose their own timeline. Fuel prices inside the United States have risen 42%. That is the steepest single-period increase since 2022 and is tracking toward the largest annual spike in at least 3 decades. Diesel prices, the fuel that moves freight, runs farm equipment, powers the logistics backbone of the American economy, are up 54% year over year. Farm bankruptcies have increased 46%. The total number of operating farms in the United States has fallen to the lowest figure ever recorded. 70% of American farmers report they cannot afford fertilizer at current prices. These are not abstract economic indicators. These are the leading edges of a structural economic disruption that, if sustained, begins to affect food production, supply chains, transportation costs, and ultimately consumer prices across the entire economy. And this disruption is not happening in isolation. It is happening simultaneously with the military campaign, the diplomatic stalemate, and the accumulating operational strain on forward deployed forces. The blockade was not a strategy in the classical sense. It was a decision to defer the harder decision. It was time bought, the military equivalent of holding a position while waiting for a political solution that is not materialized. And the fundamental problem with using a blockade as a strategic instrument against Iran is that Iran is not Cuba. The Cuban quarantine of 1962 required approximately 180 naval vessels and extended its interdiction perimeter far into the North Atlantic to be effective. Cuba is an island. Its only external supply lines ran through open ocean that the U.S. Navy could physically control. Iran is a large continental state with extensive land borders, overland trade routes, and strategic partners, China, Russia, and others, who have both the motivation and the capability to sustain Iranian access to critical goods, regardless of what happens at sea. A blockade that cannot be made total will not produce the strategic result it promises. Expanding the blockade globally, seizing Iranian-linked vessels in the Strait of Malacca, as has already occurred, introduces a different and far more dangerous problem. The Strait of Malacca is not a neutral waterway in Chinese strategic thinking. China's entire history with foreign naval power runs through that strait. The Opium Wars prosecuted by the Royal Navy to force narcotics onto the Chinese population and extract trade concessions were enabled by naval control of Chinese sea access. The Imperial Japanese Navy's dominance of those same waters in the 1930s and 1940s enabled the land invasion of China and the deaths of millions of Chinese civilians. Taiwan, the South China Sea, China's resistance to American naval presence in its near abroad is not ideological stubbornness. It is the product of a specific, documented, catastrophic history of what happens when China's sea access is controlled by a hostile foreign power. China will not watch a global blockade tighten indefinitely around a partner state and around its own economic lifelines without responding. At some point, the calculation changes. At some point, the Chinese fleet moves. 3 decisions remain on the table. The first is strategic withdrawal dressed as humanitarian statesmanship, a public declaration that military operations are suspended, that a new diplomatic framework is being pursued, and that external mediation is welcomed. This is the option that preserves the most, costs the least, in continued casualties and economic damage, and is the hardest to execute politically, because it requires acknowledging that the operation did not achieve its stated objectives. The second is sustained blockade, maintaining pressure until economic collapse inside Iran forces a change in Iranian government behavior. This option will not succeed on the timeline that domestic American political and economic pressure allows, and it risks the broader escalation that Iran has already publicly committed to triggering if the blockade continues. The third is direct military escalation, strikes, seizures, kinetic action which initiates the Iranian response that has been clearly telegraphed, activates the Gulf-wide consequences that have been explicitly threatened, and places the United States in a conflict with no defined terminal condition and no coalition of partners willing to share the burden. None of these options are without cost. The question is which costs are manageable and which are not. And the calculus is not improving with time. The longer the decision is deferred, the higher the floor on every option. The longer the force remains forward deployed at current operational tempo, the more degraded it becomes. The longer the economic pressure at home builds without resolution, the more constrained the political space for any decision becomes. The Dark Eagle hypersonic missile is a capable weapon. It may well perform as designed. It may strike targets that other weapons cannot reach. None of that changes the fundamental strategic equation. A weapon is not a strategy. Velocity is not a policy. The ability to strike a hardened target faster than any existing system does not answer the question of what comes after the strike, what the Iranian government does, what the regional response looks like, what China calculates, what Russia signals, and what the cumulative cost of the next phase of escalation is. That is the gap that no weapons system fills. That is the question that has not been answered. And until it is answered with clarity, with honesty about actual capabilities and actual constraints, no military option on the table resolves this crisis. It extends it, it deepens it, and it moves the United States further down a path that history has already marked clearly, in blood and in treasure, as a path that ends badly. That is not pessimism. That is the operational record. And the operational record does not care about the velocity of the warhead.